Hey everyone, Mr. Tweet here. So in the video today, I'm going to be going over shifting the PPC with you guys. So remember that our PPC is a graph that shows the trade-off between two things. So right here, I've got a PPC where we can producing, pens on the one axis or paper on the other axis, right? So we're making pens or we're making paper. And what the PPC shows us is it shows us the trade-off between those two things. So that, if we want, we can produce, all pens, pens only, we can produce paper only, or we can produce, some of both, right? Some combination of the two, right? And our model assumes that we're using all of the resources available to us. So that's land, labor, and capital. We're using all of the resources available to us to produce these things. So if we take all of our resources and put them in pens, then this is how many pens we'll get. If we put all of our resources into producing paper, we'll get this amount of paper right here. And then if we split up our resources, we'll get some other combination, on the curve. Now, let's say we get more resources. Well, what would happen? Well, if we get more resources, then we could produce more. Or if we were to lose some resources, then that would cause it to move in, right? Now, the question is, what are those resources? So let's say we get a shifter here that says, there's a massive forest fire and lots of trees burned down. All right, well, if lots of trees burn down, that's going to be a loss of a resource. Now, what are trees good for? Well, probably not making pens. You're probably not using trees to make pens. For pens, you're using plastic and whatever chemicals go into the ink and stuff like that. So if a bunch of trees burn down, we're probably not going to affect our ability to make pens, but it's definitely going to affect our ability to make paper. So if we were to try to make paper only, right, there's no way we could produce the same amount as before. If we were to make paper only, we would produce something like this. But if we made pens only, that's not going to change. So what happens is our curve would shift in like that. So it would go down for paper, but it would stay the same for pens. So if the resources only affect one thing, then it's only going to only that one thing is going to shift. So this time the left side shifted in, but there you go. Now, we could go back and we could look at this again. And let's say we discover a new way, a more efficient way of producing plastic, right? Well, okay, so we can produce plastic more efficiently. That's probably not going to affect how much paper we produce. Paper is probably going to stay the same. But if we could produce plastic more efficiently, we can maybe make some more pens. So pens is going to move out. And then we just draw this to there. And there you go. We've shifted our PPC. Now, sometimes, right, notice this time it was an upshift, but not a right shift. So only one side went up because the resources only affected one side. Now, sometimes the resources will affect both sides. So let's look at an example of that. Now, I'm going to erase this and redraw my PPC of paper and pens, and then I'll show you an example where we have, both of them shifting. So we'll put paper up there, we'll put pens down there. So I've got my PPC here. This time I got paper on the top, I got pens on the bottom. It doesn't really matter with the PPC, which is on top and which is on the bottom. On an AP test, if they care, they would tell you which one to put on the top and which one to put on, which one on the y-axis, which one on the x-axis. But usually they don't even do that. So here we've got a PPC that shows, if I made only pens, I could produce this much. If I made only paper, I could produce this much, and then various combinations along the way. Now, what would happen if we had an increase in the number of, like, let's say in the working age population? So we had more people turning from, teenagers into adults than we did have adults retiring from the labor force. So we have more people entering the labor force than leaving, and we have an increase in our working age population. So more labor, more workers. Well, if we have more workers, we could probably produce more pens. And if we have more workers, we can also produce more paper. So what we get here is something that looks like this. They both shift out. So sometimes both curves will shift. Sometimes only one curve will shift, right? And it depends on the resource or technology. So if it's like, if we go, going back to this right here, if we have a new technology for making paper, well, then only paper would shift, right? So let me erase that real quick. If it was like a new technology for producing paper, well, then what we would see is pens is not going to change. A new technology for producing paper, that shifts out. And then boom, we have right there. Now, if it's a new technology that does both, then they both would shift out. One thing I want to warn you about, a lot of times I see students do this right here. A lot of times I see students draw a PPC, right? And then let's say there is, paper workers go on strike. Or let's say we'll do that. Paper workers go on strike. Or we could even go back to our like forest fire that burns down a lot of trees or something like that, right? Something that affects paper only. Well, a lot of times I will see students do something like this. They'll shift one in and they'll shift the other out. You definitely do not want to do that. There's nothing that's going to make that happen. That is not something that you want to be doing. Shifting one in and the other one out. If we have a shifter, it's going to shift them both in. It's going to shift them both out. It's going to shift one in, or it's going to shift one out. But you're not going to get something like this. If you see yourself drawing something like that, where you have like the lines crossing over each other and one moving in and one moving out, then something's gone wrong. The last thing that I want to kind of warn you about is you have to be aware of situations where, well, I'll do a couple. Let's see. Sometimes you'll see something that will say like public goods and private goods. Even more common than that will be something that is like, you'll see something that will say consumer goods and capital goods with a PPC. Basically, everything that can be produced falls into consumer goods or capital goods. I mean, any goods at least are going to fall into those two categories. So now what we've done is we've created a PPC that doesn't just represent the trade-offs between two different choices, but now we've created a PPC that represents the entire society, or like an entire country or an entire economy, because everything falls into one of those two categories. So it's just a way of us to take the same ideas. There's a limit on what we can produce, for instance, or we can trade off between consumer goods and capital goods. To take those ideas from a PPC for just two things, and now we can make it so that those ideas apply to like an entire population. So sometimes you'll see something that will be like this, and then you'll get a scenario that will be like, let's say that there's a bunch of people who are unemployed, right? Well, those resources haven't disappeared. Our potential or our possible production hasn't changed if there's a bunch of people unemployed. So like what happened during, when coronavirus hit and a bunch of people are getting laid off and a bunch of people are staying home and they're not working, what does that look like? Well, our potential didn't change. We could still produce the same amount that we could before, in theory. But what happened was we produced a lot less because a lot of people stayed home. So what that would look like on this graph is that would look like us going from something like this, where we were producing pretty close to our maximum when coronavirus hit, to something like this, where we dropped way off on our production. So we moved way inside the curve, but in theory, we could have still produced the same amount. So the line doesn't move. It's just that we were not using all of our resources. So now we were somewhere on the inside of the curve, right? So inside of the curve is unemployment, it's resources not being used, right? And when we have consumer capital goods on our axes, that's one way that we could just kind of use the PPC to make a model of the whole economy. And we'll talk more about that in the next quarter, actually, when we get to quarter 3, when we get to unit 4 and unit 5, and maybe even unit 6. We will come back to this idea of the PPC as a representation of our economy. All right. So, all right. Have a good one, humans.